Have you ever noticed something strange about your emotional reactions? Even when you know better, even when you understand the situation, and even when you promise yourself to respond differently, the same reaction appears again. The same irritation, the same stress, the same frustration. And it can make you wonder, why does this keep happening? Today, we are going to explore a concept from neuroscience and psychology that explains this pattern again and again. Is the idea that emotional state can become chemically familiar to the brain, and once that brain learns a state, it tends to return to it. Why? Because it feels familiar to brain. And what does familiarity has to do with it? Familiarity gives it a sense of security, and our brain is designed to make us and keep us safe, and security is one of the ways it does that in. Now, every emotional state in the body corresponds to chemistry. Stress releases cortisol and adrenaline, frustration activates specific neural circuits, excitement releases dopamine, and calmness activates parasympathetic pathways. These chemical reactions are not random, they are learned patterns. And when a particular emotional reaction happens repeatedly, the brain strengthens the neural pathway associated with that state. This is part of neuroplasticity. The brain becomes efficient at producing that response because now it knows how to do it, it became familiar, it can do it without putting much effort into thinking, and it becomes like an efficient way of operating. So it will automatically take that path without even you thinking. And this generally at the time of stress, you're not in thinking zone. Your logical mind gets shut. What is operating is your physiology, your subconscious mind. This pattern is there in us. So it goes on repeating. So even when you decide to not get triggered on something, you still get triggered. Even when you decide to quit something harmful, for example smoking, you still do it at the time of stress, because that logical mind gets shut, the other part of the brain starts operating. Now, why negative state becomes familiar to you? Here is where things become interesting. If a person spends years reacting to situation with stress, that state becomes familiar, and the brain prefers familiarity. And if familiarity is uncomfortable, so under pressure, instead of creating a new response, the brain activates the response it already knows, like how I explained you earlier, efficient mode. Now this familiar reaction explains why some people repeatedly feel overwhelmed, irritated, defensive, anxious, even when their external situation improves. But if there is a hint of this new situation, and if somewhere this new situation is close to any of the previous one, the way you reacted that time is the same way you'll react now. This is how the body is stuck in one of the loops. Now, how does the body reinforce this loop? The reinforcement comes from chemistry. Each emotional reaction releases certain hormones and neurotransmitters. Now, when that chemistry repeats frequently, the body starts expecting it. It becomes a learned state. So, when a trigger appears, the brain quickly activates the same reaction. Not because the situation requires it, but because the system has practiced it. Now, every time any change is there, any change which is not in linkage of your body or in linkage of your mind patterns, you go in that panic zone. That is when most of the panic traumas comes into picture. These are the aligning steps, and one after one after one after, this is how the whole repetition happens. But what is important is breaking this pattern to the whole, from the root cause itself. Now, breaking this pattern requires two steps. First, we recognize the trigger point. Second, introducing a different physiological response. For example, instead of reacting instantly, you regulate breathing. Instead of escalating tension, you slow down the nervous system. This interprets the automatic pathway, and when this response repeats enough time, the brain begins to strengthening a new circuit now. Now you have a new pathway which you have consciously created, and this is how emotional conditioning changes. Now you might be asking, but still during the time of a conflict or a triggering point, I'm not thinking logically. How can I interrupt this? There is a simplest method is teaching yourself to be calmer, and that is done through breathing. I already mentioned the breathing part. Now how this needs to be done? For example, if you know that if you enter a meeting and it's going to be very triggering, if you are expecting and your gut feeling also says something, you make sure you comfort your body first before going anywhere or taking a step further. It just takes a minute max to regulate your breathing. Even 4-4-4 breathing for 4 times in a minute will calm your system down to a total base level. And once your body is calmer in any of the scenarios, your logical brain will be present at that time to interrupt these patterns so that you don't repeat the old ones and you consciously create the new ones. Now, in reset entropy philosophy, these repeated emotional reactions are described as internal loops. Now, they create internal disorder, and that disorder influences behavior, decisions, or perception. So, when these loops are reduced, clarity increases. Decision will improve, focus will improve, communication improves, internal order leads to the external stability. But there is one more bigger depth to it. You need to understand that even though we get more clarity, more order now, it's the goal is not only that. The goal is much more greater. Once you're out of the old patterns and the loops and you consciously create these new ones, and when this clarity hits you, it doesn't hit you in just a normal sense, it hits you from all angles. You actually understand who you truly are and what is your purpose in life, who do you want to be, and you connect to your more conscious self. And there is also where it doesn't end, it goes even further and makes your consciousness feel connected to you, and you understand the whole pattern and reality itself. So what I explained is just at a ground level work, but when you go automatically up, that is when your ether gets connected and you get those automatic downloads which we call in consciousness. And this is all a pathway towards it, but the base step still remains is to break the base pattern. So if you notice that certain emotional reaction repeat in your life, it may not be a discipline issue, it may be a learned emotional state, or it may be a procrastination issue. Once you understand the mechanism, you can begin retraining it. If you want a structured way to identify a pattern and start breaking them, check the link below and join my webinar. I'll give you the 3 secrets which run the whole pattern from scratch to all the way to top.